We negate resolve. The United States federal government should adopt a carbon tax. Contention 1, income inequality. Implementing a carbon tax disproportionately hurts the poor. Charles Colston at Stanford University explains, the poor spend a greater share of their income on energy costs, making them dependent on low energy prices. The American Coalition for Clean Electricity corroborates that energy costs the lowest income 78% of their household income. Unfortunately, the Brookings finds the burden of a carbon tax for the lowest income is 5 times that of the highest income bracket. Empirically, Margaret Wall's The National Tax Journal confirms that a carbon tax would increase household electricity prices by up to 16%. This is problematic because U.S. Senator Lisa Murkowski finds that a 10% increase in energy costs would push 840,000 Americans into poverty. The impact of income inequality is twofold. First, hurting the economy. James Taylor of Forbes explains that due to increase in energy prices, the American family's net disposable income will drop, which will reduce national spending and destroy jobs in all other sectors of the economy. That's why the National Rural Cooperative Association finds that it will result in 1.2 million jobs lost and a cumulative $2.8 trillion loss in terms of U.S. GDP. As such, Jude Clements of Forbes further finds that an increase in energy prices would do 2 things. First, decrease economic growth by 5.7% and reduce employment growth by 11% in the long run. The second impact is increasing mortality rates. Michael Marmot of the University School of London notes that income inequality and health are directly related as the poor cannot afford to pay for basic necessities. Consequently, due to poor health and social pressure, income inequality is directly tied to mortality rates. As Nayaki Kondo of the British Medical Journal states, the income inequality accounts for 1/3 of all U.S. deaths. Even more problematically, Hui Zhang of Ohio State University finds that for every 1% increase in income inequality, we see a corresponding 122% increase in mortality rates in the long run. This is incredibly problematic because Columbia University reports that income inequality already kills 119,000 Americans every single year. Contention 2 is increasing emissions. Counterintuitively, carbon taxes will actually increase emissions in 4 ways. First, through cheaper oil. Caroline Fisher of Yale University explains that developing economies will consume more oil when the U.S. installs a carbon tax. This is due to a drastic decrease in America's demand for foreign oil, and as a result, the global price of oil falls. In countries like India and China, opportunities to consume more oil at this low price, and she finds that on net, empirically, global CO2 emissions rise. Second is through natural gas. Robert Kaufman of Boston University explains that companies initially substitute natural gas for oil instead of moving directly to more expensive green technology. This is because natural gas is comparatively cheaper under the tax. Unfortunately, Richard J. Pierce of George Washington University finds that shifting to natural gas delays the adoption of green technology by a century because companies become locked into natural gas and delay the adoption of further technology and innovate no longer. This is incredibly problematic because Phil McKenna at PBS finds the methane produced by natural gas is 86 times worse than CO2 because of its unique ability to trap heat in the atmosphere. As a result, Christian Shearer of UC Irvine finds empirically that natural gas on net increases cumulative emissions by 5%, thus negating any climate change benefits. The third way is through carbon leakage. The Institute for Energy Research finds the high cost of doing business in America due to a carbon tax will force jobs and economic activity elsewhere, in favor of countries with lower energy prices where taxes don't eat away at their profits. As a result, Mustafa Babikar of MIT finds that carbon leakage rates could reach up to 130% overall with the carbon tax. This is really problematic because the Economist quantifies that China and India specifically account for 83% of the world's wide increase in emissions. As such, no effective climate change reduction occur without these developing economies. Fourth and finally, rolling back EPA regulation. The National Research Defense Council finds that current EPA regulations reduce CO2 emissions by 30%. But problematically, Donald Moore at the Tax and Policy Center finds that in order to build the political support needed to enact a carbon tax, they have to cut back and roll back EPA regulations that are already exist in the status quo. The impact is massive. Suzanne Brooks of the Environmental Defense Fund finds that EPA emission standards in the status quo save 160,000 lives every single year. And thus, I strongly urge a negative ballot.
So anytime before my rebuttal speech, can I see 2 cards?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so can I see the 5% increase in emissions you read in Convention 1's second warrant?
Yes.
And then the rollback of EPA policies in the fourth warrant?
Yep.
My bad, can I do 2 seconds?
Sure. Yeah, we'll look at this.
Okay, cool.
We are the first generation to feel the effects of climate change and the last generation that can do anything about it. A Boss and I stand in affirmation of the resolution the U.S. federal government should adopt a carbon tax. Our first argument is collective action. Jerry Taylor of the Niskanen Center in 2015 writes, the U.S. will raise multilateral discussions, and its adoption of a carbon tax is a necessary condition for an effective global response, where countries all around the world find carbon taxes much more attractive than the costly alternatives. Thus, Peter Howard of New York University, in a 2015 poll of over 300 economists, finds that 82% of them agree that environmental action by the U.S. would strategically induce other countries to follow suit. Our second contention is market signals. A carbon tax reduces emissions with market forces in the following two ways. The first is decreased energy usage. A 2010 Center for Climate and Energy Solutions report finds, in response to higher costs, companies and consumers would switch to low-carbon fuel sources or reduce fossil fuel consumption. Joseph Aldi of UPenn explains, consumers do not respond to higher energy prices by purchasing more imports, but instead by lowering energy usage or substituting with less energy-intensive materials. Thus, according to Sigurd Schmidt of the Copenhagen Economics, a 1% increase in energy prices decreases energy usage by 1%. The second reason is a shift to renewable energy. Currently, fossil fuels dominate the U.S. economy. A carbon tax would level the playing field. Shi-Ling Su of Florida State University in 2012 finds the increased prices of producing carbon-intensive goods would cause companies to shift to sustainable production methods. In a race to the top, competition to discover the best and cheapest technologies would reduce emissions. Stephanie Freed of UCSD finds a carbon tax would increase green innovation by 50% and decrease fossil fuel innovation by 60% by 2030, reducing the relative price of green energy by 17% compared to other alternatives. Therefore, Allstat of Regional Economic Models in 2014 quantifies a carbon tax would reduce U.S. emissions by 33% within 10 years. This reduction in emissions brings several results. First, improved health. Because reduced emissions improve air quality, Allstat previously cited finds a carbon tax would prevent 230,000 deaths by 2035. That's 30 deaths every single day. Second is mitigating climate change. Curbing global warming by any magnitude is extremely important. In a 2013 Center for Climate and Energy Solutions reports, it finds it causes extreme weather conditions, loss of biodiversity, and other hardships for current and future generations. The third result is jobs. Robert Collins of Amherst University in 2009 finds carbon taxes can create 2.7 million jobs in renewable energy, construction, and manufacturing, while taking into account the job losses from the fossil fuel industries. Our third argument is international green technology. The progress of the developing world is reliant upon energy. CBS News finds that developing countries consistently accuse developed countries for pressuring them to control emissions without providing access to green know-how. Matthew of the World Bank finds the only way developing countries can meet climate change goals without sacrificing their economies is through quickly adopting green technologies. Now they have the capabilities. Bloomberg New Energy Finance looks at developing countries' energy grids and finds developing countries' renewable energy capacity grew 143% between 2008 and 2013. Elon Musk states in The Guardian, because a carbon tax reduces the relative cost of renewable energies, developing countries could leapfrog past fossil fuels. In the past, when the U.S. advanced cell phone technologies, developing countries jumped past landlines and leaped into the world of mobile phones. Even better, Taylor and Fisher of Resources for the Future explains the availability of low-cost ways to take on emissions targets could incentivize developing countries to adopt carbon regulations in the future. Please affirm.
We'll take a look at that.
All right, so everybody ready? Can I have the first question? All right, so the RUMI study that you cite, right? How did it come to the calculation about the lives saved? How did it come to that big 25,000 numbers of lives?
Yeah. They statistically analyzed how the carbon tax would be reducing emissions and harm, like,
so that's not
decreasing the amount of
right?
pollution.
That's not specific at all. I'm asking for like specific methodology.
I mean, I have the card if you want to look
Right,
at
so
this.
the issue with the cards, I'm going to clarify real quickly, right, is that they basically describe an arbitrary value to the amount of emissions, then divide and sum it all together,
Wait.
and then and then divide by the amount of human life. They divide by the amount of human life cost, $6.2 million, and they come to this random amount of 257,000 lives. So again, why is this mathematical leapfrogging everywhere at all relevant to today's rounds?
Okay, so first of all, they don't just randomly say that a carbon tax is going to decrease emissions.
No, I'm not talking about the reduction in emissions. I'm talking about the monetary value they ascribe to the emissions. You can look at your card if you want. That's what it says. It says an arbitrary value to the amount of emissions,
Okay, sure, we
and
can
then divide it by the amount of human life, or that's a human life cost, which is kind of absurd in the grand scheme of things.
Okay.
It's not actually a reduction in lives.
Thank you. So we can ask the judges to look at the card afterwards.
Sure, I'd love to do that.
I have a question for you.
Go for it.
So in today's debate, should the United States enact some sort of climate change legislation? I do agree climate change is the problem.
Let me reframe that a little bit, right? As the affirmative ballot in today's round, right, you have to prove essentially an improvement over the status quo. We tell you the status quo is solving for the problem through EPA regulations. We're not going to answer that question directly because it's kind of absurd.
Yeah, let's talk about EPA regulations.
Sure.
You bring up this Marin evidence,
Awesome,
right, in your
yes.
contention too.
Correct.
So does Marin say that we're completely going to get rid of EPA regulations, or does Marin rather say that we're going to suspend EPA regulations until we determine a carbon tax is better than EPA regulations?
Suspending until pending further removal, right? And we tell you that the more conservative Taylor from the Nickens Center you cite in the case as well tells you specifically that overall we're going to see a complete removal of all EPA
No,
subsidies.
Taylor says, he says that I read the card.
Right, sure.
So Taylor says that we should he recommends conservatives to get rid of EPA regulations because they're that bad and they're
awesome. So conservatives. So in the current political climate,
I have a question for you.
You asked 3 in a row. So maybe clarify the last question.
Okay.
So quickly on to the political climate issue, right? Republicans currently are in Congress, they're in power. We tell that in order to pass any kind of carbon tax, we have to curry the conservatives' favor. That's why we see complete eradication of EPA policies.
Right, but Taylor isn't talking about the opinions of all conservatives.
All right, next question if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
All right, so we have this idea about renewable energy, right, and like how it's going to switch to that extent, right? How much is renewable energy cheaper than natural gas in the status quo?
So in this
Yes,
data,
no question, really.
some sorts of renewable energy are on the same stage
Like
as
what?
natural gas. For example, solar and wind
So,
energy.
so you tell me solar energy currently can account for the same amount of production of energy that natural gas can?
Yeah, I'm pretty
Can we
we
pull
have
that card?
we have
Sure.
a Bloomberg
Love to
business
see that.
reference, yeah.
But at the point where,
So-
yeah, sure, go ahead, next question.
Okay, yeah. So when you're talking about James Taylor and how increased energy prices would destroy jobs,
That's
what's
correct.
the link between energy prices and destroying jobs?
Reduced consumption by the consumer and leading to overall jobs loss in the economy. That's the clear link.
Would you like to concur? Yeah, we'll do
Actually, can you pause for a second? Can we just see the one card, the 1% increase in energy prices leads to 1% or 1% reduction in energy usage? Yeah, maybe one. Can we stick to the exact line, because this is just product price and then cost. Where's exactly?
So it's the if you look at the 1% part.
Okay.
Yeah.
Harker?
Costing again to give it back to you. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, we'll do. Sorry. Okay.
Do you want to see it now or just anything?
Like, if you can move it to me sometime, or you have, or whatever. Also, can you add counter to that as well, the counterpart for conservatives? Like,
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks.
Alright, we'll just do this.
Alright, so you want to roll that, and what was the second one?
The 5% increase in emissions in the second warrant of Convention 2.
Okay, yeah, so they're all on this one.
Okay, and it's okay if I read this during your speech?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you so much.
Alright, is everyone ready? Let's start off with a quick observation, and that's that in their own case, they tell you that other countries adopting a carbon tax is a necessary prerequisite to seeing any benefits. Hold them to the standard. They need to show that other countries are going to be signing on in order to be accruing any of their benefits. Let's look at their first intention when they talk about collective action. There are a few responses to this. First of all, recognize that this is just very non-unique, and it's actually happening already anyways. In fact, according to Mark Clifford of Forbes, China is already enacting a cap and trade system designed to cut emissions by 2017, and India has already implemented a carbon tax. In fact, 19 countries so far have already implemented a carbon tax without the US spearheading leadership. That means that the United States doesn't need to be at the head of the pack in order to get other countries to sign on to climate change policies. But then second of all, recognize that those countries that have not decided to enact climate change policies so far are probably not going to concede in the future. This is because Aubrey Cass of the Manhattan Institute explains that if they haven't started pursuing climate policies now, these developing countries won't accept costly policies that would slow their economic growth and hinder their population's climb out of crushing poverty. This logically makes sense because they're always going to be prioritizing the material well-being of their own people over some climate ideal that the international community desires. But then third and finally, recognize that we should be looking to historical precedent because that's what's most likely to inform what happens in the future. In fact, according to Nicholas Flores, he finds that there's a historic precedent of repeated UN negotiations where the United States leads, but there's very small likelihood that any of these developing countries even sign on. That's important because we're showing you that historically it just simply hasn't happened. Even though it would be an ideal solution, it simply isn't happening. Let's move on to their second contention about market signals. First, they talk about decreasing energy usage. First of all, you can turn this argument because we specifically tell you in case that it disproportionately hurts the poor. But then second of all, their evidence just says that there's an increase in price with the carbon tax in place. Never does it say it actually decreases energy use. That's very important because they're not linking into their benefits. But then their second warrant is on renewable energy. There's a few responses to this. As a general overview, look to Roman Kilisek, who explains that investment in renewable energy has increased by 17% over the past year, meaning renewable energy investment is already happening in this current world. That means they need to show you that the renewable energy in their world is outpacing the renewable energy investment that's already happening. But then second of all, recognize, according to Kevin Bullis of the MIT Technology Review, he actually finds that right now, governments have to mandate the use of renewable energy in order for companies to even shift over to renewable energy because it's still a much more costly alternative. In fact, that's why we tell you in case they're actually shifting to natural gas, not renewable energy. In fact, he specifically tells you that a carbon tax would not be enough to spur that shift. But then third and finally, historically look at the precedent. In fact, according to Cass at the Manhattan Institute, Europe's carbon prices are already higher than any US carbon tax would drive them, yet we've seen zero green innovation as a result. Then they tell you about this general reduction in emissions. First of all, that number. Recognize Avi tells you in Crossfire that methodology doesn't even account for carbon leakage. That's very important because it's not actually looking at the global effect that it creates. In fact, second of all, you're going to be looking to Paul Knappenberger of US News. He tells you that 93% of emissions globally are by developing countries like China and India. That's very important because David Evans of the Financial Post explains that even if the US completely stops emitting, it would only be 0.0015 degrees cooler, meaning there's a very negligible impact and it wouldn't actually amount to anything. But then third and finally, remember, we tell you about carbon leakage. There's a 30% rise in other countries. That's very important because even if we're cutting back on emissions, that's not really helping our own citizens when it's actually increasing in other places with laxer environmental standards. Then they talk about the creation of jobs. First of all, recognize that according to David Kreuzer of the Heritage Foundation, he tells you it actually leads to the aggregate loss of more than 1 million jobs by 2016 alone in the fossil fuel industries. But then second of all, the green tech investment is simply not outpacing it since Thomas Chadwick finds that for every 4 jobs created, 9 are lost. Finally, they talk about international technology in their third contention. Recognize that this is very non-unique. Specifically, they tell you that it grew 130% between 2008 and 2013 when there was no carbon tax in place, meaning that this is already happening without the United States adopting a carbon tax.
Yeah, we'll be taking a little bit of time.
That's all.
17 seconds.
Yeah. You guys can have your computer back.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Let's begin with a simple idea that the chance that your house catches on fire is 2%, but you still buy house insurance, right? We tell you that the chance of extinction within the following century, if we don't act on climate change right now, is 11%. That means a vote for the affirmative is your life insurance. With that, let's move on to the first key, for their first argument, which talks about income inequality. They talk about how we're going to be seeing electricity prices increasing and a great burden on the poor. We have two responses to the links that they put here. The first response is coming from Morris of the Brookings Institute that finds that 11% of the revenue that's generated from using a carbon tax can be used to completely offset the bottom 20% decile of the poor. This is really important because if we're offsetting the cost, the poor aren't going to be harmed. But secondly, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, we're going to be seeing a 7.3% decrease in electricity prices by 2030 as we see more shifting towards renewable energies. Even in their own world, where we're seeing a shift towards increasing renewable energies, we see decreased electricity prices. With that, let's move on to my opponent's first impact, which talks about consumers and job losses. They tell you there's a 2.1 million jobs lost, but you should outweigh this with our opponent's evidence, which tells you that there's a 2.7 million jobs gained on net. And he takes into account the jobs lost through the fossil fuel industry. The warrant for this, the link for this, is that the UNEP explains that for every one job created in the renewable energy industry, there are 6 jobs created in the service sector industry. Now let's move on to my opponent's second impact, which talks about health. We have two responses here. The first response is going to be that Yale explains to you that the poor people are more vulnerable to climate change because they reside in more pollution-dense areas. Therefore, if we reduce climate change at the end of the debate, that's the best way to tackle this inequality. But the second thing is going to be, they never terminalize any of their impacts. The 119,000 deaths that they talk about is not unique deaths that a carbon tax can completely solve. The 230,000 deaths that we talk about are unique to a carbon tax and specifically to how much the US can address. But even more so, we would still be outweighing our magnitude. But now let's move on to my opponent's contention 2, which talks about emissions. Their first argument is talking about global demand increasing. Our first argument would be that you can cross-apply this with our leapfrogging argument, where basically we tell you that developing countries can adopt the zero carbon technologies from the United States. When the developing countries shift towards renewable energy, we're not going to be seeing them increasing their demand for oil prices. Their second argument is about natural gas, and we have 4 main responses here. The first response is going to be that according to the Guardian, through chemical processes that exist within nature, in 12 years, methane in the air actually disintegrates. That means this isn't even a long-term impact. But secondly, this is non-unique. The EPA explains the problem is with fracking that causes leaks that occur, and not the inherent problem within methane itself. But this is really important because my third response is from Malwitz of the Texas Tribune, who explains that leaks range from 0.01 to 47.8% of the natural gas. The majority being on the very low end of leaks actually occurring, and the very large leaks that occur are easily fixable. And that leads me to my fourth response, which is from the EPA, which says that crackdown on these leaks has actually been increasing in the status quo. In fact, as of January 2015, Obama has the EPA regulations that would reduce methane emissions by 40 to 45% by 2020. Since August of 2015, we've already seen a 25% decrease in methane leaks that are actually occurring. This is really important because their impacts don't go to the long term. Now into their sub-point C, which talks about leakage. We have 3 main responses here. The first response is their own evidence about Babacar of 130% is 3 problems with it. First, it's not specific to the United States leakage. Secondly, it's very outdated from 2005. Thirdly, it's talking about the Kyoto Protocol, not a carbon tax. But secondly, we would argue that according to the resources for future RFF, they basically explain that even if there's a 10% reduction in like U.S. emissions, we're only on net going to see a 1 to 3% increase in leakage. That's not going to be outliveable. But third, Morris explains to you that there's no leakage on the global level because companies actually prefer local market conditions. Their fourth argument about the rollback is very problematic. They misconstrue their evidence. The evidence says that we're actually going to keep with the EPA regulations until we can prove that a carbon tax is actually effective. At the point where a carbon tax would be effective, we wouldn't need their EPA regulations. And for these reasons, I can see no ballot and one for the affirmative. Thank you.
Yes, we are.
Can we also see the 12 years evidence?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Can I get that check?
Yeah, and then also the legal show.
Oh. Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Texas Tribune and yeah.
Sure. Okay.
Alright.
I think you have the first question.
Sure. So let's look at like how we're framing today's debate. Would you argue, so like this whole insurance policy argument, would you argue that if we can prove like a reduction or an increase in emissions, that's going to be like what decides that?
No, I would disagree with you. I would say that there's a unique reason why carbon taxes we are reading through the Dutch court firm. A carbon tax gives a long-term signal to these companies to actually shift their productions towards renewable energies because they know in the future fossil fuel can like if they can
No, this is like a broader just like framing.
No. I know, like framing this argument, I would say there are unique benefits to affirming specifically with a carbon tax.
Sure,
Do you mind
but
if I ask
if
you a
the
question?
emissions are going to increase anyways long term, that's still a reason to negate.
I would disagree with that, but I guess if you could like prove somehow
Alright,
like
yeah,
emissions
go ahead.
increase. Okay. So you argue basically that like a lot of this like income inequality is affecting the poor. The poor are going to be in sustainable like areas, right? Or
even if you prove a decrease in emissions, right, you still can't prove like solving that climate change as a whole. Like
Okay.
that's very specific. Like we read a piece of evidence, right, saying that even if the United States cut all of its emissions to zero, there'd be very, very minimal change
Okay.
in temperature, like 0.0015.
so what happened at the Paris climate talks that happened in the December of 2015?
There was a non-binding agreement between a lot of countries.
Okay, so when does that non-binding agreement become binding?
A couple of months, but there's nothing saying that it will become binding or that these people will actually follow through with their commitments, like have they in the past.
Okay, so what have the other countries said at the Paris climate talks?
In terms of global agreements, like historic precedent, let's look at that, right? Because I feel like that informs the future, right?
I mean, I would say to some extent, but we should still look towards what's happening right now in the current
Have
political
countries
climate.
ever, like, in these, like, negotiations, have they ever actually gone through with their commitments?
Yeah, for sure. I would say your own
What's an
example
example
about
of that?
I would say your own example about China, like actually putting a cap and trade program forward in the following
No,
year.
I would say that that's actually the reason why the U.S. doesn't have to put in a carbon tax in order for that to occur.
The argument is that the U.S. has influence, right? That's what I'm trying to prove to you.
Sure, and
The China,
that influence can come with influence. Like, why does it have to?
explaining?
Sure.
Okay, so what I was trying to say is that the reason why China put forward a cap and trade program is China agreed to work with U.S. tandem together to actually address climate change.
Sure.
They said as long as the U.S. cooperates, we will cooperate as well.
Sure, that could be true, but why do we need a carbon tax in order for that to be true, right? Like
Okay.
the United States is already a climate leader in certain
This
ways
is
from
really
like
important,
EPA
right?
regulations.
This is really
like,
important.
You need to prove to me the unique
Yeah,
link to carbon
this
taxes.
is the unique link. We give you Tara of the Niskanen Center, who tells you that a carbon tax is a necessary burden to show U.S. unilateral leadership.
No, that's
What-
not actually what the card says. The
Yeah,
card,
it
as you
does.
read it, you said other countries adopting climate change policies is a necessary.
I can show you the evidence. It says it's a necessary prerequisite for a carbon. Like if you put a carbon tax forward,
Well, in
that's
terms of
necessary.
what George read in the case, like he said, other countries adopting like climate change policies is a necessary prerequisite to solving that climate change. I think that's actually a burden on your own case because then
I
you
would-
need to show that other countries are going to adopt it. And insofar as we can show that
That's-
that's not necessarily true, then I'm not sure if you're getting.
I will disagree, but that's like what. Okay. Do you mind if I ask you a quick
Sure,
question?
go ahead.
Okay, so you talk about these leakage rates, right? Tax or the Kyoto Protocol?
Yeah, so he talks about just climate agreements in general, like a country adopting a climate policy.
Really?
Yeah, like
Okay.
regulations.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, anyone taking prep?
Let's go to prep, yeah.
And so,
So we have 44.
Not in prep, are you guys exchanging evidence, what are you doing?
oh yeah, I was gonna have some cards for you guys actually.
Yeah, sure, we'll get going for that.
Okay.
Are we prepping or waiting?
Wait.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Okay, start.
Yeah. Alright, we're good.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. Yeah.
All right, brief thoughts on Roma. I'm going to go over two observations and then down our case offense. All right, opponents ready? Judges ready? Jasmine ready? All right. First observation, when they completely dropped the observation, Jasmine doesn't put in a rebuttal, saying essentially this. They must prove uniquely that other countries are signing on as a result of the carbon tax. They drop a lot of responses in their rebuttal, and here's why they're really important. We said that China and India have already created a carbon tax or a cap trade that's already happening, and they have to prove that you use this unique link in order for them to gain all their offense. Their own card says that countries need to sign on in order to gain their offense. That's important. Hold them to that standard. The second observation, that even though climate change is really important and we should get house insurance, we solve for the problem in the status quo. They also been improving over the status quo in order to get any of their impacts. Now let's go into our impacts. First, on income inequality. They give two responses here. First, they give you that are relevant. First, they give you the offsetting the cost with the rebates. The problem is twofold. First, it's not probable going to happen in the status quo. Kreutzer tells you from the Heritage Foundation tells you overall that not a single plan has ever passed with a rebate, and more importantly, even if it were to pass, it would go to special interest groups, not to the poorest of the poor. At that point, rebates are irrelevant. The second response gives that energy prices will drop. That's really problematic to the point where half of his case talks about energy prices rising. That's a contradiction. We'll point that out. And moreover, that means we have one really important impact you're going to be studying around. A 10% increase in energy prices leads to 840,000 Americans going into poverty. That's dropped in the rebuttal. You can vote off that alone. Now let's go on to emissions rising. There are going to be two reasons why emissions rise are really extending today's round. The first comes to you from natural gas. They get four responses here. First, they give you the Guardian. It'll only last for 12 years. The problem is that for every time methane release, it lasts for 12 years. That's not an overall net decrease. So at that point, it's still a problem. Then they tell you overall, it's not unique because it happens in fracking. Fracking is an inevitable part of the process. It'll always happen when you mine natural gas. Third, they say that overall leakage rates are only really low. The problem is Shearer looks at the low leakage rates, assumes low leakage rates, and finds a cumulative rise in 5 emissions. So even given the low leakage rates, we still see those impacts. And finally, they talk about EPA current plans solve for the problem, but not completely. Only 30% of the problem is solved according to their card. So we still have the impacts. Increase overall emissions by 86 times worse, and moreover, delaying green tech by 100 years. That takes out all their offense and the green tech argument. And last but not least, on EPA, call for the card, it's legit, and more importantly, we tell you specifically that we save 160,000 lives every single year, and it's legitimate because we show you specifically that the conservatives will push for complete repeal instead of suspension. So I'm going to take it back.
You guys need prep? Yes.
Start, yeah.
is 1 minute and 5 seconds.
You have 37 seconds left.
Yeah. You guys ready? All right, great. So let's begin. Remember what a boss tells you in the overview. Wilson of the PNAS explains that there's a risk of extinction of 11% in the following century. That's really important because we have to assess this risk and ensure for a brighter future. So that means that if you have a risk of solvency on the affirmative, then you should be voting for the affirmative. Moreover, we tell you from Yale in response to the second contention that the poor are disproportionately harmed by pollution, and therefore you should be prioritizing pollution and climate change above their economic impacts. The first key voter is going to be ensuring for a brighter future. Go to our contention 2 on market signals. They try to say that from this kilosec evidence that renewable energy investment is already occurring within the status quo. However, unless we adopt a carbon tax, we're going to be unable to reach the gap between fossil fuel and renewable energies because we're unable to increase the price of fossil fuels because they're that much more competitive. We're unable to switch to fossil fuels. For example, if I have 2 cars that have, one is relying on fossil fuels and another is relying on renewable energies, I'm not likely to use the renewable energy one unless fossil fuel prices increase, unless the price of gas actually increases. That's why we see a decrease in the use of emissions. They say that the EU didn't work, but keep in mind the EU was a cap and trade program, and cap and trade programs inherently have a lot of price volatility because they're selling permits. Moreover, they tell you that carbon leakage is going to occur. But keep in mind, in response to our first contention, they say that China and India are already implementing environmental policies. So that means that leakage is not going to occur because their Babaker evidence is from 2005, so you're not going to be looking towards that. Then they say that there's a net decrease in jobs, but keep in mind, we tell you that there's a net increase in jobs from the Collins evidence from Amherst, who actually takes into account the decrease in jobs. So we see a net increase in 2.7 million jobs. Remember the Sioux Florida State University evidence. Because there's going to be a rise in long-term fossil fuel prices, we're going to be shifting to renewable energies and decreasing the price of renewable energies by 17%. They misconstrue our Taylor evidence. Our Taylor evidence says we need U.S. participation as a necessary condition for global responses.
All right. Everybody ready for class?
Yeah.
All right, awesome. Can I have a question?
Yeah.
All right, so you give this car analogy about there being renewable energy and there being coal, right?
Yeah.
Don't we think there's a third car, natural gas, in the picture that is actually cheaper than coal and renewable energy? So why is it relevant? Why would any consumer go to the renewable technology?
Yeah, sure. So you're going to be valuing what we talk about in today's debate over what you talk about as natural gas, because we tell you from the EPA that the methane emissions from fracking are easily reversible because the EPA regulations actually solve
your
the
plan solved for 30%, not 100%. So
Wait.
So I looked at the car, it says 30% of the residue will be obtained. At that point, 70% of the impact remains, and the impact that remains is 86 times worse than any CO2 emissions in the world. That's really problematic, and you're causing climate change impact to talk about all over again.
Okay, what we tell you though is that EPA crackdown is only going to be increasing in the long term. We don't tell you that EPA is almost once we reach 30% reduction, EPA stops. Our business is done.
Sure.
What the EPA is going to do is they're going to keep on cracking down on these methane leaks because methane leaks are harmful.
Promise, for some reason, doesn't respond to the fact that we tell you that fracking is inevitable, right? The emissions that come from fracking will always happen no matter what.
Then it's not unique to
it's not unique, but it's unique to natural gas. Natural gas always requires fracking.
We always frack. We frack for oil.
Sure.
We frack for other things as well. We always we frack for a lot of different things.
Uniquely for natural gas, fracking is required. That means that fracking specifically causes all the harms you talk about. That's what's unique for our side. That's what we give you.
Right, so let's look at the warrant level debate, right? You
Sure.
keep on talking about, we definitely will see a shift to natural gas
That's right.
because there's decreasing carbon emissions
Yes.
in natural gas. But keep in mind, we tell you from...
Where's the question here? I'm confused.
Because, okay, we'll ask you a question.
Sure.
All right, so you talk about this income inequality and these harms on increasing electricity prices,
That's correct.
right?
Yeah.
So, in your last speech, you try to talk about this
10% increase in energy prices leads to 84,000 people.
No, that's from Forrester.
That's not Forrester. That's
Okay.
from Forbes.
Okay, so why are these trillions of dollars Why are these
These aren't
jobs?
dollars. These are just
Well,
people going to poverty straight up, right?
Why are people?
Wait,
Okay, wait.
Why are people?
Let me explain. Yeah, sure. They're going to poverty because they don't have the money to pay for their energy bills. It's a very simple link, very simple warrant, right?
Okay.
The only way you respond is through yellow card. Yellow card would be a proper summary. The
No.
problem is that right with the climate change, this is
No.
going to be the most important
We
thing. The
also
problem with climate
say-
change is that it happens in the long term. In the short term, right here, right now, people are losing their jobs and they can't pay for their bills. That
Okay.
means we have poverty impact in the very short term.
We
Their
also-
impact eventually in the long term.
Right. We also tell you that immediately after we pass the carbon tax, electricity prices are going to be decreasing by 7%.
That's problematic in your case specifically says energy prices will rise.
No. Energy prices rise initially, but then we see a 7.9% decrease for the
In the
long
long term,
term,
but again-
ensuring the poor have
Right.
access to
The problem
energy
is
more.
that doesn't negate a short-term impact of like 800,000 people going to poverty.
But
That
wait.
still happens no matter what, right?
No. We tell you that the 840,000 people going to poverty is not going to happen because we see the rebates being given
But
back
you
to
drop
the
that in
poor.
summary. The problem, I can tell you that rebates will never happen unless you
No.
drop in summary cold, right?
Wait.
Like, rebates will go to the special interest groups nowhere else. Yeah, that's like a problematic for your side. All right, we'll take remaining group thanks for time.
All right, is everyone ready? All three judges, and photos. All right. So recognize there are two observations. First of all, they must show other countries are signing on and will actually adopt the same policies that they're making. This is an observation we make continually throughout the round. Recognize they never meet this burden because George completely dropped multilateral action and cooperative action in his summary. That means that they're not gaining all of these impacts because we tell you, remember, even if the US reduces its emissions to zero, the temperature would only change 0.0015 degrees. That's very important because they're not accessing any of their impacts. But then second of all, remember, you need to be comparing it to the status quo. If it's actually making the status quo even worse, then you're not going to be doing it. And that's very important because we tell you it's going to lead to the rollback of EPA regulations. They never effectively respond to this. We tell you currently there's not enough political capital in Congress to do both EPA regulations and a carbon tax, meaning once a carbon tax is put in place, they will roll back EPA regulations. That's very critical because right now EPA regulations are saving 160,000 lives annually. This is the biggest lives impact that is being read in today's round. You can vote on that. But then let's look at the first voting issue, which is on income inequality. First of all, we tell you, not a single plan has passed with rebates in place. That's the reason why rebates are not actually going to be occurring. But more importantly, Kreutzer tells you, and they never respond to this, that all of those rebates would actually go to special interest groups, not to the poor. That's where we link in. We tell you a 10% increase in energy prices will drive 840,000 Americans into poverty. You're going to be outweighing on scope and on magnitude. But then second of all, recognize that the only offense they go for in their summary is in green energy. First of all, there are two responses. In the European Union, it's specifically a carbon tax, and they specifically saw no green innovation as a result. But then second of all, we read two cards saying governments have to mandate it, carbon tax is not enough. They don't respond to that. That's where we're going to be really winning on natural gas. This is the biggest thing you can vote for us on. We specifically tell you that with the carbon tax in place, people are going to be shifting to the cheaper alternative, which is natural gas. However, that delays the adoption of green technology 100 years. Methane is 86 times worse. You see an overall aggregate increase in emissions by 5%. They don't even touch this in their summary. This is the one place you can vote because if we're exacerbating all of those problems of climate change, then you don't want a carbon tax.
We're using a little bit.
begin by addressing framework. Now, the one thing that she says we never address is that other countries need to sign on as well. We never prove that. But we do in every single speech. Terror of the Niskanen Center says that it's a necessary burden on the United States to put a carbon tax forward that will allow other countries to follow on suit, because they see that the U.S. is taking strides in actually creating a solution. They're more likely to cooperate as well. We tell you this every single speech. Other countries are more likely to cooperate if you affirm. Therefore, if you think that other countries are less likely or not cooperating right now, vote affirmative because they're more likely to cooperate. With that, let's move on to the first key order, which is going to be going green. Now, my opponents tell you that natural gas is the biggest reason why you can vote for them because it's so harmful. They completely drop all my responses in the final focus. I tell you that natural gas is naturally removed from the atmosphere in 12 years. I tell you that we're cracking down on natural gas and we're going to be seeing a 45% reduction in it in the upcoming years. This is really important because that means that their impacts at best are only going to be very small and not going to be wearable in that round. But here's why you can vote for us. We tell you the unique benefit that a carbon tax is going to put forward. Keep in mind the car analogy. I can drive either a fossil fuel run car or an electric car, but I'll drive the electric car more often if the price of fuel actually increases. That's exactly what a carbon tax does. It increases the price of fuel. That means I'm more likely to use renewable energies if the carbon tax is actually there. That's ultimately going to be really important because we tell you that renewable energies are going to decrease the electricity prices on the poor. That's my second key voter, which is going to be how the poor are affected. Now, my opponents tell you that income inequality is the biggest thing in today's debate. They completely ignore the response that if we're reducing climate change, that we're actually going to be affecting the poor. We tell you we're reducing climate change because we're shifting towards green technologies. On net, right there, the poor are going to be benefited. But then they tell you these electricity costs and 840,000 people being pushed into poverty. It's not like we see an 11% increase in electricity costs and people pushed into poverty right away. They don't do any time frame analysis here or like how long it'll take for these people to be pushed into poverty. But we tell you that on net, in the long term, we're going to be decreasing electricity prices, right? So when you don't be misguided by the short-term problems when we have the long-term solutions in our hand. And for these reasons, to build a better world, we must first have to seek it, and that requires care and priorities. And for these reasons, you should affirm.